Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next session on incorporating patient and consumer input. I think this is a really fun and challenging topic, trying to understand patient and consumer preferences and desires. Sometimes as humans, we don't know what we want. Sometimes we know what we want, but we don't know why. Sometimes we know what we want and we know why, but as a researcher, we may not have the best tools to kind of elicit that from people. So in today's session, we're going to get a showcase of a bunch of innovative strategies for really getting accurate and reliable information about what people want and need. We have a great lineup. We have Susan dosReis and Julia Slejko. They will be presenting on stated preference methods. Dr. dosReis is a professor of practice sciences and health outcomes research, co-chair for research at the School of Pharmacy at the University of Maryland, and co-director of the Patient-Driven Values in Healthcare Evaluation Center. Her research focuses on pharmacoepidemiologic methods to study medication safety and population health outcomes research and stated preference methods to assess patient-centered benefit-risk trade-offs in medication decision-making. She's received funding from the NIH and PCORI and has recently received an FDA Research Scientist Collaboration Award to evaluate stated preferences for regulatory decision-making. Her current research involves post-marketing safety evaluations and the impact of regulations on medication quality. She and Dr. Slejko are presenting together. Dr. Slejko is an associate professor of practice sciences and health outcomes research at the School of Pharmacy at the University of Maryland and co-director of the Patient-Driven Values in Healthcare Evaluation Center. Her research is focused on innovative approaches for economic and health outcomes assessment. Her current research includes work informing economic evaluations with real-world evidence, novel value elements, and equity-informative measures. Dr. Hargraves is an assistant professor of medicine in the Knowledge and Evaluation Unit at Mayo Clinic, where he leads research on human-centered design of shared decision-making interventions, developed to support the conversations in which patients and clinicians think, talk, and feel through medical decisions together. Most relevant to today's topic, his current work includes a project developing and validating a measure of shared decision-making. And then I am Meghan Moran. I'm an associate professor at the Bloomberg School of Public Health at Johns Hopkins University. My background is in communication, which I apply to both marketing, in this case today, tobacco marketing, and then on public education and communication. So I'm going to kick us off. How do I move forward? There we go. My disclosures, I've served as an expert witness on litigation against the tobacco industry. Broadly, the work that I am presenting today has been funded by several agencies, including the NIH, our CERSI, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and the Borough's Wellcome Fund. And I just want to give a big thank you to our collaborators at the FDA. I'm going to start off just by giving a brief overview of how tobacco products interface with the Food and Drug Administration, talking a little bit about how we assess consumer response to marketing materials from the tobacco industry, how we kind of try to get at kind of causality through experimental designs, and then just briefly touch upon some new and emerging techniques here. So I wasn't quite sure how familiar the audience would be with where tobacco products fit in with the FDA. This is a relatively newly regulated product, maybe within the past decade, a little bit more. The 2009 Family Smoking Prevention and Tobacco Control Act gives the FDA authority to regulate tobacco products. Clearly, the traditional standards of safety and efficacy don't really apply here. Unless you're looking at the efficacy of a tobacco product causing cancer, perhaps. So FDA uses a different standard, a public health standard, and this applies to the range of ways that tobacco products can be regulated. We are interested in the regulation of marketing of tobacco products. So one of the kind of key areas that FDA is interested in is what we would call unauthorized modified risk claims. So a tobacco company advertising that a product maybe has some benefit, some reduced harm that it doesn't actually have or has not been authorized to claim. Obviously, you need to be 21 to purchase tobacco products, or you need to, it's more of like the age of sale for tobacco products, so the industry should not be marketing to youth. And then finally, FDA has engaged in a multitude of public education efforts. I have images here just from two more recent campaigns: the Real Cost campaign, educating youth about the harms of cigarettes and e-cigarettes, and then a campaign geared towards smokers, Every Try Counts, encouraging them to keep trying. It's hard to quit tobacco, so attempting to increase motivation here. What we do to study this is kind of a sequence of methods. The first thing we want to know is what the industry is even doing. What is being said about these products? What are consumers exposed to? We collect and code, at this point, over 8,000 tobacco advertisements for different features and characteristics. Then we show these advertisements to people ranging from teenagers up through adults to get their perceptions of the products and the advertisements themselves. We use these findings to conduct controlled experiments looking at the effects of different advertising features. And then more recently, we've been using some newer techniques, including eye tracking, neuroimaging, an ecological momentary assessment, to get kind of more comprehensive assessments of consumer response. So I first want to talk about how we combine what we know from the tobacco industry's marketing with consumer response. We rely on market research agencies, a company platform now called Vivix, formerly Numerator and Kantar, two separate agencies. The Trinkets and Trash Archive, which is at Rutgers University, it's an archive of tobacco advertisements, and we do our own data collection by following tobacco companies' social media. We double code all of our ads for a variety of characteristics. These are just some of the more relevant ones here. What are they saying about the products? How are they attempting to engage consumers? What product features are being highlighted here? We then show advertisements to people. The data I'm going to show you here today are data with young adults. We used Qualtrics, which is a research panel and a survey development tool. And we randomized participants to view 3 cigarette ads, 3 e-cigarette ads, selected randomly from a pool of 147 ads reflecting the top brands for each product. And we assessed 3 things, which are kind of key steps on the trajectory from exposure to an advertisement to ultimately the decision to use the product. Did they like the ad? Did the ad make them curious about the product? And did they have an interest in using the advertised product? And then we dichotomize these for the presentation, which you'll see when I show you the results. We use mixed effects logistic regression analyses, which allow us to merge all of the data we have about the advertisements. Is there a sweepstake? Is there a coupon? What do the people look like in the ad? With the consumer data, including characteristics that might make somebody more likely kind of predisposed to use a tobacco product. And this also just allows us to account for random variation. Like some tobacco ads are just better than others. And I think you'll be able to see this in some of the images that I'll show you shortly. So what did we find here? This is the data for cigarette advertisements. We found that some key advertising characteristics seem to be driving appeal. Among youth, we see sweepstakes, gifts, rebellion themes, that this is somehow like kind of risky or rebellious to use the product, or themes about the product helping one socialize with others were kind of drivers of what we call receptivity to the advertisement. And then in the young adults, sweepstakes was the key thing that stood out here. We also were able to kind of rank the ads. What were the ads that people liked the most and liked the least? So these are the least liked ads. You can take a look at them. We see a couple for Marlboro, Winston, Newport shows up in there. And then compare them to the ads that people liked the most. And you can just kind of see the stark contrast in the use of colors, the imagery, right? We see lots of plants and so forth in the ads that people like. So ultimately, what we're taking away from this is that sweepstakes are a key feature of concern that seem to be driving appeal among young folks. This is especially troubling because in addition to just kind of like making the brand more attractive, it's a way to collect data about consumers and then subsequently market to them further. And so perhaps techniques such as like content neutral bans, expanding where advertisements are unallowable, plain packaging, graphic warning labels could be considered to help reduce appeal of tobacco products to young folks. Moving on into some of the experimental designs that we used, I want to kind of take the thread of the plant-based imagery and talk a little bit more about how this is used by the tobacco industry. This is a technique called greenwashing, trying to make a product seem eco-friendly or all-natural. It's something that consumers find attractive. So the tobacco industry, in particular this brand, American Spirit, has used the terms additive-free and natural to describe their product. A wealth of research has found that consumers think a product that is additive-free and natural is safer than the comparative product without these marketing claims. Based on this research, FDA restricted use of these terms. You can see some of the language from the letter that they sent to the parent company of this brand. But what we have found is that the industry uses many more tactics, and I think you can just kind of see in this image here, right? You see two words, but there's a lot else going on to make the product seem kind of eco-friendly. So in this study, what we did was experimentally manipulate 4 different greenwashing features, which we had found by analyzing marketing tactics. We have imagery of a leaf. These are just some of the kind of exemplar variations of the ads. Textual claims, which are about how the product was farmed in an all-natural, eco-friendly way. The pack design is a greenwashed pack, and then the background of the ad, which you can see in the bottom image of like this rumpled, recycled paper, all natural. Participants were randomized to view one of these ads, and we assessed 5 key indicators of risk perceptions: absolute and relative harm, absolute and relative addictiveness, and then perceived nicotine content. And what we found was that when consumers saw an ad featuring the imagery of the leaf or the greenwash text, they were significantly more likely to have inaccurate, reduced harm, addictiveness, and nicotine content perceptions. So the evidence from this study aligns with kind of a long line of research that our group and others have done. Just to really hammer home the comparison, I just want to show you the difference in risk perceptions between the ad with no greenwashing and the ad with all greenwashing. And these ribbon charts just sort of show you this shift. The red indicating harm and the green indicating kind of safety perceptions. You can see, again, just kind of how much less harmful people think the greenwashed product is, even though there is 0 evidence indicating this is actually the case. So what we found is that beyond the restricted terms, there's a lot of ways the industry is trying to mislead consumers to believe a product is reduced risk in ways that are not authorized by the FDA. We know that these risk perceptions are linked to, in particular, attempts at quitting tobacco, and also initiation among young people. But the bigger question here is kind of just what is the regulatory energy, right? Is this a game of whack-a-mole? We go after one term, the industry comes up with something new that is like technically, legally allowable. So just something to kind of keep in mind here. And then finally, just to highlight a few new and emerging techniques, eye tracking is something that our group and many others are using to assess attentional response. So what in particular in our work, what in public education materials is really attention grabbing to people? This is often one of the first things that we really think about in order for a piece of communication to work. People need to actually attend to it. So by making sure our messaging has attention-grabbing features, we can kind of start that cascade of effects. Neuroimaging is another newer technique that our group and others are using to kind of supplement self-report data. Our group is using FNIRS, which is kind of a more portable form of neuroimaging. Others, like Emily Falk's group at UPenn, have used fMRI to really look at activity in key regions of the brain associated with effects such as self-referential processing, which is something we like to see, or counter-arguing, which is something we don't like to see. And then finally, and I'm kind of pointing specifically to one of our collaborators, Johanna Stroll, ecological momentary assessment has been used as a novel way to deliver educational messages kind of in real time. Often a lot of work that we do relies on these like one-shot exposures and what do people think, when we know in reality people are exposed to public campaigns, ideally much more regularly and over time. This also has the benefit of assessing effects both in real time and longitudinally as well. So some key takeaways for use of these approaches. One thing to always be thinking about is representativeness of the sample. Who is important here? Who is the priority population? For us, a lot of our work focuses on youth and young adults because these are key age groups that are at particular risk for initiation of tobacco products. However, there are other priority populations as well, such as maybe people who have smoked for decades and are having trouble quitting. And so the outcomes that we might want to see from a public education campaign targeting young people might look very different from those of a public education campaign targeting people who have smoked for a long time. Finally, just thinking about the validity of different approaches, right? We can conduct these tightly controlled experiments, but they may lack the external validity of real-world message exposure over time in very loud and noisy environments. And then finally, message heterogeneity. If you think of the range of advertising that you are exposed to in the course of a day, in the course of an hour even, many ads are using the same techniques, but they're deployed very, very differently. So we always need to be thinking of not just the message strategy that we are testing, like the educational message, for example, or the key claim that the tobacco industry is making, but testing that broadly over a range of brands, different types of stylistic or aesthetic choices in the advertisements. I want to say thank you to our team. These are just some of our teammates who have participated in the work that I showed you today. And then, of course, again, our FDA collaborators. And here's my contact information if you'd like to get in touch. Thank you. All right, so next up we have Susan dosReis and Julia Slejko presenting on using stated preference methods to incorporate patient input for benefit-risk decision-making.
Okay, thank you very much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm Julia Slejko from the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, and I'll be presenting with my colleague Susan dosReis. And we're going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing at the PAVE Center, which is at the School of Pharmacy. Our work is centered on understanding patient values in their healthcare decision-making. And a primary goal of what our research is all about is eliciting information that is important for individuals when they are making healthcare decisions. Patient preferences are a part of that information and, in fact, a way to quantify some of the important elements that patients care about. So that's what we'll talk about today. Not sure about this. There we go. Okay, so first I'll mention that our center was established as a Pharma Foundation Center of Excellence in Value Assessment about 5 years ago. And just to give you a sense of what our presentation will go over, first I'll talk about just the methods that we use in our center and some of the formative qualitative work that we use for preference studies, and then Susan will talk about some specific empiric case examples using stated preferences methods, and some findings in the context of benefit-risk decision-making, and finally, about a project that's in collaboration with the FDA. So patient preference information can be used in a lot of different decision-making contexts in healthcare. But there are some specific ways that stated preferences information can be used in regulatory decision-making. So if we think about the drug development pipeline, the pathway, in the beginning of that, you can use patient preference information to begin to identify patients' unmet needs, for example. We can also use stated preferences information to evaluate alternate endpoints and evaluate outcomes that are important to individuals, echoing the comments from the past session, some of the points that Eleanor made in particular about outcomes that are important to patients. We can use preference methods to understand those better. And also, preferences information can be used to provide valuable insights on benefit-risk trade-offs, which I mentioned. Susan will present some work on that. So first I'll start by telling you a little bit about the formative work for stated preferences methods. And some of this can be qualitative work, and I'll tell you about the process that we've developed for eliciting some of the information that goes into developing our stated preferences, methods, and instruments. So one of the main reasons that we're interested in patient preferences and eliciting things directly from patients is because that we believe that some of our existing methods don't always capture the things that are important to patients, and whether that be for decision-making, economic evaluation, other outcomes assessments, or regulatory decision-making. Those are some of the reasons why we would like to perform a preferences study. And because of that reason, we think that we should really start directly with engaging patients and working with them to understand, well, what are the elements that should go into those preferences instruments to measure those better. So by starting with patients, engaging them directly, we can begin to then figure out what are the domains and the individual elements that can be used in our stated preferences instruments. And that we think by starting at that point, we can then create an instrument that will be able to help us best collect the information that's relevant for people who are living with particular conditions. So this qualitative work can then be formative to developing stated preferences instruments. And at the PAVE Center, we've developed a really systematic, bottom-up, iterative approach for identifying the elements that can then go into those stated preferences instruments. And this began several years ago when our center was established, and we elicited from a wide range of people living with a number of different conditions, what are the elements that were important to them? And so on this graphic, we have a list of about 40 elements, and they fall within these 5 domains. So the domains are about treatment effects, treatment access, treatment cost, life impacts, and social impacts. So once we understood this wide range of elements, what we've done over the last few years is to develop a systematic process for then understanding among specific clinical conditions which of the elements are most important for those conditions, so prioritizing the elements within those different domains, and then understanding how we can put those elements into an instrument so then we can quantify the preferences for those different elements better, and then that quantified information can then be translated to different types of evaluations, whether that be economic evaluation, other types of decision-making, or decision-making in the regulatory context. So I'll just briefly tell you about a couple of clinical areas that we've explored in that regard. So we've had 2 studies, one in chronic obstructive pulmonary disease and one in major depressive disorder. And while these were both in partnership with different stakeholders, the goal of these was really similar, which was to prioritize and refine the elements to then develop a stated preferences instrument for that specific condition. So I'll tell you a little bit about what we found. So these colored boxes represent the domains that were important to those patient groups. So you can see there are some that are similar. So for example, treatment costs, that was a domain that was important for both patient groups, and in fact, the element affordability was important for both of those groups as well. Not surprising. Another similarity was that both groups valued life impact, so that was a priority domain, but the element that was important was different for those groups. So in COPD, it was more about physical abilities, and in depression, it was more about quality of work and productivity and being able to function at somebody's in career or school. Then we found a couple things that were a little bit different. So in COPD, there were a lot more prioritized elements in the treatment access domain. So those individuals were more concerned about how they were going to access their care, whether there were new treatments that were available to them, et cetera. Whereas in depression, there were more elements that were important in the treatment effectiveness domain. So by doing these prioritization exercises, we can really begin to understand what are the elements that are most important, where do they fall within that spectrum of the different domains that we have categorized in our framework. So then that information can be used in a number of ways. So again, going back to the previous session, though that information could be used for helping us understand outcomes and endpoints on its own. That information can also be used in different patient-centered decision-making contexts or design and structure of economic evaluations, which is an interest of mine, but also, as I mentioned, for developing instruments to quantify patient preferences, which is what Susan will talk about, and I'll pass it over to her.
Great. Thank you, Julia, for that really wonderful introduction. And good morning, everyone. And thank you to the organizers for the opportunity to present my work on patient preferences and benefit risk assessment. In the 15 or more years I've been working in this field, I really have seen how stated preferences have evolved and continue to evolve. And particularly in the field of bringing patient preferences and stated preferences into regulatory decision-making. And just to kind of get a grounding point for this, there's different ways we can define patient preferences. So from a stated preference perspective, we're looking at individuals making choices in a hypothetical situation. So it may not be their own specific situation, but given these scenarios, how would you make a choice? And then we have revealed preferences, which is essentially looking at how and what people are actually selecting and choosing and inferring those choices from observable data that those were their preferences for treatment. And so both aspects of patient preferences can have very valuable inputs to how we think about the way people will respond to new products or to novel attributes of a product. One of the questions, though, is if we measure stated preferences, does that really align and is that consistent with what they actually do and what they actually, the choices they make in real life settings? So as Julia said, we're going to present some of the empirical cases from the work that we've done, and this is related to the project that Julia just presented on major depressive disorder. So on the right-hand side of the screen, you can see a choice task, and that displays 3 different options that an individual can make a choice from. And this is how we design our discrete choice experiments. And so we are forcing people to make a choice among very discrete options here. Within each of those options, there's 6 attributes, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen in the framework that we developed prior to actually developing that instrument. So we include in each of those options one level of the attribute. And so as you can see, the range of those attributes can differ, and so people have to make a decision based on those levels, what is most acceptable to them. And in this particular experiment, we included the mode of treatment, so whether somebody only had medication or they were able to have medication with non-pharmacologic interventions for depression. We have 2 attributes that relate to symptom relief, so the time to treatment effectiveness, so when they start to feel the effects of treatment, and also symptom relief with regard to the days per week that they feel hopeful. So you can think of these as some target measures that we could typically measure in a clinical trial through a clinical outcome assessment. The other two attributes, the quality of work and the interaction with others, those reflect the life impact and functioning of individuals from the perspective of how productive they feel in their day-to-day. And then interaction with others is really more of their social interactions with society and people important to them. And then finally, we had a measure of the cost that they would be willing to pay out of pocket. So you see how we have a range of different outcomes and costs and the type of treatment. And when we build them into the experiments, we run our regression models, and they're conditional logistic, or we can have a mixed logit model. And the benefit of that is you have the beta coefficients from the analysis that we can then graphically display as we see here. And what that tells us is when you vary the level of that attribute, how much would that change someone's preference or utility for that particular attribute? We use this data to then see which of these attributes have the largest variation between the highest and the lowest, and that is a signal that that attribute is something that someone is very sensitive to when they're making decisions about a particular treatment. And then we calculate the relative attribute importance, and that's what I have displayed at the bottom here for you. And you can see that costs, that's almost always the case. Cost is a very big driver, but you also see relationship with others was actually almost as important and was the second most important attribute in this experiment. And when you look at the mode of treatment, that actually fell much lower. So we're able to kind of distinguish among the attributes that are important in decision making in that particular, for example, for MDD. Now, in the second example, we actually looked at a specific medication class of antipsychotics. And in pediatrics, antipsychotics are associated with an increase of metabolic adverse side effects. And we know that from the data. And so these are decision points that individuals and caregivers have to make. Do I want to use a medication that has these known adverse effects? With the hopes of a benefit for my child. And so in this particular experiment, you see in red, those are 3 adverse effects that are known with these medications used in pediatrics. And the levels that we selected were drawn from the empirical data and the evidence published that is known about the risks of these particular adverse effects. The items in blue are the benefits, and those are items that we derived from the formative work with our patient advocates and people in the community. So how important it was to reduce self-harm, to reduce the number of days that a child was having aggressive behavior, and to reduce the number of hospitalizations. On the right-hand side, you see how we put that into a discrete choice experiment and a choice test in a very similar way. And we followed up with a second question saying, would you use the choice you selected? Knowing that we're presenting hypothetical scenarios and none of them may be acceptable, but you're forcing me to make a choice. And so we added an extra question to see, would you really use it? In this example, so we run the same analyses, but we're able to do a calculation to understand where is that benefit-risk trade-off. And when is an individual, how much harm are they willing to accept in order to trade off for a benefit? And so you see the preference coefficients, which are the beta coefficients from our regression models. And if you go from doubling the risk to tripling the risk of diabetes, there's a utility loss of 0.38. If you improve by decreasing hospitalizations from 2 per year to 1 per year, we have a 0.49 gain in utility. And so the difference between those two is 0.11. So we look at this and say, well, how much more of an increased risk of diabetes would actually completely wash out the gain from reducing hospitalizations? And if we go from 3 to 4 times the risk, you see that utility loss is 0.20. So they won't quite go to 4. And so we interpolate between that, and we calculate that individuals would be willing to accept a 3.55 increased risk of diabetes that would completely balance out the improvement by reducing hospitalizations. So in this next slide, I just wanted to kind of illustrate that when we elicit preferences from a Likert scale response, where every attribute is its own question, and you ask them how important is it, we get very little discrimination across attributes because they're all typically important to individuals. when we embed them in our state of preference methods in discrete choice experiments, you see that there's a lot more variability, and we're able to really kind of pick out those attributes that seem to be more important relative to all others. So there is a benefit in terms of distinguishing these. So moving into kind of the next phase of this work, and I'm very excited to have the opportunity. We are just getting this off the ground, so maybe in a future CERSI conference I can present the results of that. But we will take this a bit further and really assess stated preferences in the context of revealed preferences. If stated preferences are moving in the direction of informing regulatory decision-making, then how do they really kind of align? And when we think about this work, these experiments can be crafted in a number of different ways to answer various questions. And I think there's a real opportunity for this work from patient preference, stated preference work to complement what we have from clinical trials where there are standard clinical outcomes assessments. So we have efficacy metrics for clinical trials. Well, how does that improvement in a particular outcome measure that we capture in clinical trial then correlate with what's important to patients? And I think that's an added benefit of really understanding the impact of newly marketed products. So I'll end there, and I look forward to questions during the panel discussion.
Thank you. Up next, we have our third presentation from Dr. Ian Hargraves, comparing methods for identifying patients' preferences at decision-making.
Well, hello, everybody. I would like to begin by acknowledging and thanking the FDA and the Office of Women's Health for their support in this project. Today I'm going to be looking at patient preference information, but specifically in the context of at the time when patients are making decisions alongside their clinicians. As we've just talked about, patient preference information is important because it can help identify benefits and risks and important trade-offs for patients. It can inform things such as study outcomes and evaluation trials. And notably, there's a growing interest in using patient preferences in post-market evaluation of medical products. There is a set of preferences that are particularly important, and those are the set of preferences that are at play at the point in time in which patients and clinicians are making decisions together, because it's these preferences which are going to determine what products are adopted by patients as forms of treatment. It's also a particularly important place to look because, and Matt made the observation this morning, that the genome isn't a stable entity. Well, the preference gnome, if you will, is also not a stable entity. And so understanding the state of preferences at this point of time is very, very important. Unfortunately, and I think from my perspective this is a very serious issue, what happens inside clinical encounters is still largely a black box. The amount of research that looks at what happens inside those encounters is, in the large scale of things, quite minute. And so there's a need for methods that we could bring into this context to help us understand the preferences that are at play. And so what this study does is compares three potential methods for identifying patients' preferences at the point of decision-making. The first one is an observational method where encounters are video recorded and later analysed. The second two are immediately post-encounter methods, so straight after the encounter, interviewing patients or surveying them to gain insight into what their preferences are. As a case for this study, we used spinal cord stimulation. SCS is an implantable device for the treatment of chronic pain. There's been 9 approved devices since 1981. It involves the implementation of the device within the body and the insertion of electrical leads into the epidural space of the spine. It typically begins with a trial period where the device is mounted externally before final implementation. This work was conducted in the pain clinic at Mayo Clinic with patients who were scheduled for an SCS consultation or education. It happened over the middle of the COVID epidemic, which introduced some interesting complications to the study. The clinician participants were pain medicine physicians, nurse educators, and clinical fellows. So this project had 2 phases. In the first phase, we developed the instruments that we were going to later in phase 2 compare. So we used a human-centered design process which began by observing encounters and debriefing with patients and clinicians following to get a sense of what are the waters that we were walking into. And then we went through a process of iteratively developing and field testing prototype instruments, so ways of capturing data and later on analysing that data. A number of issues came up through this phase 1 work, one of which is the clarity of preference expression. So in the videos, what we found was that only 6% of what we later deemed preference statements took the direct form that I preferred this, or this would be good for me, I would like to do that. And so for an example of something we were looking at, here's an instance where a patient is asking, how long does this procedure take? Patient isn't saying that it's important to me how long this procedure takes, but the fact that they're asking the question is perhaps an indication that there's something there that's important to the patient. So it raises the question, are we looking at a preference when we're looking at that? From the statement, can we determine whether this preference is actually meaningful for the patient? And at the further extreme, is it actually affecting the decision that the patient's going to make? Another issue was that we found that across the different methods, preferences were attributed or motivated by different things. So in the context of an encounter, a lot of the preferences arose out of descriptions of the context. So, for example, I tried tramadol. I didn't really like it. It just made me go to sleep. So a preference perhaps toward STS was derived from the limitations of existing treatments, or cast in terms of action. So I'd be able to take a shower during that trial period. Notably, it was rarely about the device. Only in 4% of the times was the preference statement actually about the device itself. And so, and I should add to that, but we saw different patterns in interviews and surveys to that sort of distribution of attribution of preference with the videos. So we needed to find some way to not ignore data when people were talking about preferences in different ways. And so we used, from the field of rhetoric, which is used to dealing with changing and variable preferences, Kenneth Burke's Grammar of Motives. And so we ended up coding in terms of this set here. Act refers to things that people are doing. So, for example, the shower instance that I just gave. Agent refers to people who are at play. So this example is the opinion of other people potentially influencing the decision. Agency is the device itself. So what are the attributes of the device that are at play? The purpose, what will be achieved through this, and the scene, so the tramadol example, that's actually at play in determining what's desirable or less desirable. In terms of a unit of analysis, we chose the preference block, which was essentially a series of speech terms where patient and clinician were talking about something that was conceivably desirable or undesirable in the context of SCS treatment. When we brought surveys into this, we essentially took a survey question and said that this is a preference block. And so for here's an example, coding from a video. A patient's asking the question, how long will this take? The clinician responds, typically 45 minutes. So here they're talking about an act, the act of the duration of the procedure, the theme and sub-theme, identify the topic. we can, by looking at this, we're not clear whether they're talking about something desirable or undesirable. 45 minutes, is that good? Is that bad? I don't know. We can't tell if it's important, and we can't tell if it's affecting the decision. Whereas if we look at an item from the survey, here's a response to a question, looking at the patient's sense of the importance of how important it is that SCS improves my mood. Here we're talking about the purpose of the device, and we can, from the response, we can determine that the patient thinks this is clearly desirable, they think it's important, and they express this affecting their decision. And so when we moved into the comparison phase, what we did is we worked with 13 patients. 6 patients were in an arm where they had their encounter video recorded and subsequently interviewed. Another 7 patients had their encounter recorded and subsequently surveyed. You can quickly scan the demographic information. I'll move on. And so, in terms of results, what we found was that video yielded the highest number of preference blocks or parts of discussion where they're talking about something that's potentially desirable or not. Interviews, a mean of 25, and surveys, a mean of 33. You'll notice the range is much smaller in surveys than it is in the video encounters. From those preference blocks, we were able to identify 38 themes from videos with 75 sub-themes, so these are essentially preference topics, and that number diminishes across interviews and surveys. But if we look at the proportion of these preference blocks from which we were able to derive whether what was being talked about was important or affecting the decision, what we saw was that the percentage was relatively low in the video observation and increased to being quite high in the survey. So sort of inversely proportional to the number of preference blocks that we were identifying. Interestingly, it was hard to determine what was clearly not important. It was easier to determine what was important. If we looked at how preferences were attributed, what we see is that in the video, the vast majority of preferences were attributed to something in the scene. I think it's 65% of preferences. Whereas, for example, the agency itself, the device was only 5%, very low, and I'm having trouble seeing this, I'm sorry. But we see variation in other modalities. So for example, in the survey, purpose was rated very highly, although it was only 4% of the preference blocks arising in the videos, which is somewhat counterintuitive. But when we look deeper, what we see is that what this lower chart shows is the proportion of those attributed preferences that were deemed important or affected the decision. And so, for example, although there's only 4% of preference blocks were talking about purpose in the videos, 83 of those times they were talking about it, they were actually saying that this is important, it was affecting my decision. In terms of overlap between the different methods, so here we're looking at the 7 patients who were videoed and surveyed. These lists are the list of the 4 most prevalent themes in each of these modalities. You can see that only 3 preference topics overlapped between the survey and the video. The degree of overlap was higher in the interviews, so we're seeing more people saying the same thing essentially in both the videos and the interviews. And so in conclusion, what we found was that videos yielded the most preference blocks and preference topics, but the significance of the preference was less clear. Surveys provided clear expressions of important or decisive preferences, but the topic set was quite constrained. the interviews in some sense balance the number of topics and the clarity of which people were expressing what was important to them or not. It was very interesting to us that the attribution of preferences varied with the method. So what people are going to say is important is changing with the method of which you're trying to ascertain that from. And I think this warrants further investigation. And ultimately, we think the best method depends on the purpose that you're trying to achieve. So videoing encounters is great for the exploratory phase where you're trying to get a sense of the gamut of issues that may conceivably important, whereas surveys, for example, might be more useful in sort of a confirmatory phase where you say, okay, we think this is the set, let's go and confirm it, because of the time investment is significantly lower, of course. All right, well, thank you guys.
Hi. Yeah, that was a great panel. Very interesting. So I have a question, I think, for Susan. So Susan, you were talking about, the, I think, antidepressants as well as the antipsychotics, and you showed patient certain kinds of patient preferences, et cetera. And I guess I was thinking, as you were talking, well, wouldn't that depend upon the age, or wouldn't that depend upon the ethnicity, or so? Do you do those kinds of subgroup analyses, and what do they look like, or they tend to not be factors?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And can you hear?
I don't hear you.
I don't hear it on either, but
Somebody should turn her mic on.
okay, I think it should be now. Okay. I did not present data on demographics in the interest of time. For the depression cohort, this was a cohort we had recruited across the U.S., and a good number of them had been living with depression for 10 or more years. They were chronic depressives. We do administer symptom severity scales as part of the work. So the preference instrument gets embedded into a survey. And so we are able to then look at heterogeneity by some of these, what I call observable characteristics. We have looked at this by their severity of the symptoms at the time, because they're filling it out at the time they're doing the survey. We've looked at this in terms of differences by the impairment on their productivity, so people that have had more or less impairment due to depression. And we have done it by race, ethnicity. We also do it, look at heterogeneity from analysis of latent class. So rather than saying that people would differ based on how we characterize them by race or other factors, we allow the patterns of responses in the data to then identify groups that might be more aligned with certain aspects of these attributes than others. So we have done that, and that is an important part. So one is, what is the overall preference, but then how does it differ by subgroups? And yes, that's part of the work that we do.
Okay, thank you very much.
I feel like I saw, yeah.
This question is for Ian. Oh, thanks. This question's for Ian. Did you do any pre-encounter engagement with either of the populations? And then my second is, was there any way to get a sense of the degree to which the patients in this study believed they had preferences? So I know sometimes patients feel like it's somewhat prescriptive. How did you kind of measure how much they were introduced to the concept of having preferences and their ability to express those preferences in any of those modalities?
Sure. So the first question, no, we didn't talk to them ahead of decision making because we were specifically interested at the point where they were making decisions. And more so, we didn't want to influence the preferences that were going to come up at that point in time. Your second question around, it slipped my mind, sorry.
Oh, just about how do you know if there's variation between a patient's ability to feel like they have preferences in their expression of those preferences at decision making?
So that's not something that we looked at, although in the video encounter, I think it's interesting how many statements of things that may or may not be desirable were floating around, but whether people would say that they were actually preferences. So, for example, that question that was being raised about whether I could shower or not, that's not exactly a preference necessarily. Let me go on a small tangent. So one thing that we found here was a class of preferences, what we call preferences of no concern. So this was a good example where, yeah, this would be an undesirable attribute if in the circumstances I couldn't take a shower, but because I could take a shower, it's not exactly a preference, but it would be something important to know in understanding the value of this particular intervention.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, great. I think we break for lunch then. All right, thank you, everybody.